First one out the other side.
Sean is a teenager in the US, the kind who constantly pushes limits and refuses to follow rules. Because of his reputation, every time he walks into school, security stops him for a full check, just in case he's hiding something dangerous. He's got a serious passion for cars, though not just driving them but being around them. That's why he spends his free time working at a local auto shop. Whenever he heads to school, he usually borrows one of the cars from there. One afternoon after classes end, Sean notices something eye-catching parked beside his ride, a sleek Dodge SR T-10, powered by a roaring V10 engine. Inside, a stunning girl sits casually, legs crossed, painting her nails like she doesn't have a care in the world. She glances over at Sean and casually compliments his car. Sean shrugs it off, saying it's not even his, it belongs to a customer. They barely exchange a few sentences before things take a turn. The girl's boyfriend spots them talking and instantly gets territorial. He storms over, accusing Sean of trying to flirt. Sean isn't impressed. He sizes the guy up as all muscle, no brains, and decides he's not worth the energy. Without another word, he hops into a classic 1970s Chevrolet Monte Carlo and pulls away. But the situation doesn't end there. Furious, the boyfriend grabs a baseball bat and smashes the rear window of the Monte Carlo. That's enough to set Sean off. He jumps out, gripping a wrench, ready to settle things right then and there. Before it escalates further, the girl steps in with a suggestion. Why not race? Winner takes her. That's all it takes. Pride kicks in, and suddenly a whole group gathers, heading out to an empty industrial area. The rules are simple. One lap first across the finish line wins. Unlike technical street racing, this is more about straight-line speed, pure acceleration. The girl signals the start in her own dramatic way, tossing her bra into the air. Both cars launch forward instantly, the Dodge and the Monte Carlo tearing down the road, but the boyfriend plays dirty. Using his friend's cars, he blocks Sean's path, turning an already narrow road into a complete obstacle. With no clear route ahead, Sean veers off onto a rough dirt path near a construction site, pushing the car harder. For a moment, it looks like he might actually pull ahead, but then he spots it, a dead end straight ahead. No time to think. He clenches his jaw and barrels forward, forcing his way through the only path available, even if it means risking everything. Somehow, he manages to catch up. As he pulls alongside the red Dodge, he throws the girl a confident wink, making her grin. That single moment pushes the boyfriend over the edge. Now it's not about winning anymore, it's personal. Fueled by anger, he starts slamming his car into Sean's, over and over. Finally, one heavy hit sends both vehicles spinning out of control. The red Dodge crashes violently into a sewer pipe, while Sean's Monte Carlo flips and rolls before coming to a halt. The crash leaves all three of them bruised and battered. Soon enough, they're hauled off to the police station. Sean's mother arrives, clearly exhausted by the pattern. In just 2 years, she's already had to move 3 times because of his reckless behavior. This time, she's had enough. Without hesitation, she makes a decision. Sean is being sent away. She puts him on a plane to Japan, where his father is stationed. His parents have been separated for years, and now Sean finds himself heading to Tokyo, a place completely unfamiliar to him. As he looks out the car window at the vibrant, fast-paced city, his thoughts are all over the place. Confusion, frustration, curiosity, it all mixes together. But this moment marks the beginning of something much bigger. After tracking down his father's address, Sean rings the doorbell. It takes a while, but eventually, the door opens. His father looks surprised to see him, noting that he's arrived earlier than expected. He tells Sean to wait a second. Then, awkwardly, a Japanese woman slips out of the room, clearly someone his father was spending time with. The apartment itself is tiny, almost cramped. It's obvious his father has been living alone for a while. There's barely enough space, and Sean is given a small storage room to stay in, just big enough to fit a bed. When he pulls back the curtain, an elderly woman from the neighboring building cheerfully greets him, adding a strange sense of warmth to the unfamiliar environment. Soon enough, Sean steps into a completely new life, as a student in a Japanese high school. Everything feels different. He puts on a uniform, catches a packed train early in the morning, switches into indoor shoes at school, lines up neatly for lunch, and even learns to eat with chopsticks. Surprisingly, he adjusts faster than expected, and before long, he meets someone who becomes his first real connection there, a smooth-talking guy known as Twinkie. Twinkie's always hustling, selling random gadgets and items to anyone willing to buy. He proudly tells Sean he owns a unique car, something special. That immediately grabs Sean's attention. Curious, he asks to see it. Twinkie takes him to a parking garage, hyping it up the whole way. But when they arrive, it's not exactly what Sean imagined. Instead of a high-performance machine, it's a green Volkswagen. Sean can't help but feel slightly underwhelmed, but hey, at least it's something with wheels. So where do car enthusiasts hang out in Tokyo? Twinkie has the answer. He brings Sean to an underground car scene, a place packed with modified rides and passionate drivers. As Sean looks around, taking in the impressive builds and custom designs, something catches his eye. A girl steps into view, driving a heavily modified Mazda RX-8. Her presence is impossible to ignore, and just like that, Sean realizes he's stepped into a whole new world of racing. Sean couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen that girl somewhere before. It didn't take long for it to click. She was actually in his class. Her name was Neela. Curious and confident as ever, Sean walked over and struck up a conversation, completely unaware that his presence was stirring trouble. Not far away, someone was watching, and not happily. Around here, everyone knew him as DK. The moment he noticed Sean talking to Neela, his expression hardened. It didn't take long to understand why Neela was his girlfriend. DK stepped in, warning Sean to keep his distance, but Sean wasn't the type to back off. Instead, he fired back with a sarcastic remark, clearly not intimidated. Tension started building fast. DK looked ready to make an example out of him, but then remembered he had a race coming up. He held himself back, deciding it wasn't worth the distraction. That should have been the end of it, but Sean wasn't done. Fueled by pride, he threw out a challenge on the spot. "I'll race you." DK looked at him like he was joking. Sean didn't even have a car of his own. What exactly was he planning to race with? Just then, a calm but commanding presence stepped forward. It was Han. Without saying much, he tossed Sean a set of keys. "You can take mine." Han and DK had business ties, but in that moment, Han seemed more interested in seeing what this reckless newcomer was made of. Sean, still clueless about the deeper dynamics at play, accepted without hesitation. As they made their way to the race location, Sean casually asked Twinkie if DK's car was anything special. Twinkie gave him a look that said everything. "Do you even know why they call him DK?" he asked. "It means Drift King." The term meant nothing to Sean. He frowned, confused. What's drifting? He was about to find out the hard way. The car Han lent him wasn't just any vehicle. It was a finely tuned Nissan Silvia S15, a machine admired in drifting circles like a masterpiece. Equipped with a turbocharged engine pushing around 250 horsepower, it demanded skill to control. Sean, however, had none of that experience. Nervous now, he asked Twinkie for a quick lesson. Twinkie, half serious, told him, "When you hit a corner, yank the handbrake and floor it." That advice didn't exactly inspire confidence. The race lineup was set, Sean in the Silvia, facing DK in a Nissan Fairlady 350Z, a more powerful car with around 287 horsepower under the hood. The atmosphere tightened as the signal to start approached. As the race began, Sean did what he knew best. He slammed the accelerator and surged ahead in a straight line. For a brief moment, it looked like he had the upper hand. DK, on the other hand, stayed calm, almost relaxed, not rushing at all. Sean allowed himself a small sense of victory until everything changed in an instant. A sharp turn appeared ahead. Unprepared and inexperienced, Sean panicked. Without any understanding of drifting, he drove straight into a support pillar with a brutal crash. Meanwhile, DK slid through the corner effortlessly. His car, gliding like it was part of the road itself. Desperate to recover, Sean got back in pursuit, but from that point on, it was a one-sided display. The parking garage track was full of tight corners, the perfect stage for DK's skill. He hugged every turn with precision, barely missing the walls, while Sean struggled to keep control, crashing repeatedly. Metal scraped against concrete, sparks flying, the car steadily falling apart. Then came the final stretch, a spiraling ramp leading to the rooftop. DK took it flawlessly, drifting upward in one smooth, continuous motion. It was a moment that left everyone watching in awe. Behind him, Sean's car was barely holding together. By the time he reached the finish line, the Silvia was completely wrecked. The race was over. Sean had lost badly. As he stood there limping and battered, he watched DK drive off with Neela, frustration burning inside him. But things weren't finished yet. Han approached him, calm as ever, and told him something unexpected: he shouldn't leave the city. Later that night, Sean returned home, already anticipating trouble. His father was furious. The lecture that followed was harsh and direct. If Sean kept going down this path, he'd end up in serious trouble, maybe even prison. For a while, Sean tried to keep his head down, going back to the routine of a normal student. But that didn't last long. One afternoon after school, he found Han waiting for him outside the gates, leaning against a sleek Mazda RX-7. Without much explanation, Han motioned for him to get in. They drove to a traditional Japanese bathhouse. Han told Sean to go inside and find someone named Claw to collect money. Sean had no idea what he was talking about, but he went in anyway. Inside, it didn't take long to figure it out. A massive sumo wrestler stood out immediately, his back covered in a fierce tiger tattoo with extended claws. That had to be the guy. Sean approached him, trying to demand the money, but before he could get anywhere, he was thrown out without hesitation. That should have been enough to discourage anyone, not Sean. Stubborn as ever, he went right back in and got thrown out again. Eventually, the sumo wrestler stormed outside, clearly annoyed, and handed over the money to Han just to be rid of the situation. He wanted nothing more to do with Sean. Han watched the whole thing with quiet interest. There was something about this kid, his persistence, his refusal to back down, that caught his attention. That's when Han made a decision. He brought Sean into his circle, offering him a role as his driver, someone he could rely on whenever needed. Not long after, Han took him to a pachinko parlor. These places, filled with loud pinball-like machines, were hugely popular and often controlled by organized groups. As it turned out, this particular parlor belonged to DK. That's when Sean began to understand the bigger picture. DK's uncle was a powerful figure in the Yakuza, and both DK and Han worked under that influence, running their own side operations as well. From the start, not everyone welcomed Sean. One of DK's men took an immediate dislike to him and even tried to provoke a bet involving one of their boss's cars. Meanwhile, Han and DK stepped aside to talk business, leaving Sean outside. Checking the time, Sean realized he was once again running late. With a sigh, he called his father, letting him know he wouldn't be home on time, again. While Sean was on the phone, someone else arrived at the scene, Nayla. She had come looking for DK. Spotting Sean, she quietly warned him that this wasn't the kind of place he should be hanging around. It was clear she wasn't as reckless as the people around her. Later, Han brought Sean to his own territory, a fully equipped garage packed with tools and modified machines. It was like stepping into a mechanic's dream. Without much ceremony, Han handed Sean the keys to a red Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution VII. This wasn't just any car. It packed around 280 horsepower, came with a 6-speed manual transmission, advanced handling systems, and a reinforced frame built for performance. For anyone serious about driving, it was a machine to respect. With that, Sean's real training began. He started practicing drifting at an abandoned pier by the ocean. The wide-open space gave him room to experiment and crash, a lot. He slammed into barriers, spun out repeatedly, and struggled to control the car. Nearby, 2 older men fishing watched the chaos unfold, shaking their heads in disbelief at what they were witnessing. One morning, as Sean was getting ready for school, something caught his eye across the street. His father was in the garage, working on a worn-out classic car. From the looks of it, it seemed like an old 1967 Ford Mustang, but in rough shape, barely more than a shell. That moment sparked something unexpected. For the first time, father and son found common ground. They began talking, not arguing, not clashing, but actually connecting over their shared interest in cars. His father offered him 2 pieces of advice, drawn from old Eastern sayings. The first, the bird that stands out gets shot first. The second, the child who cries gets the candy. They were simple, but meaningful lessons about knowing when to stand out and when to stay quiet. His father hoped these words would help Sean navigate life in Japan more wisely. At school, things took another turn. Sean was suddenly dragged up to the rooftop by a group of students. It turned out Twinkie had gotten himself into trouble again, this time by selling fake electronics to the wrong people. One of DK's associates wasn't amused and had already started roughing him up. As tensions escalated, it looked like a fight was about to break out, but Sean stepped in. Instead of throwing punches, he pulled out his own device and handed it over as compensation. Just like that, the situation cooled down. The crowd, expecting chaos, slowly lost interest and dispersed. From the sidelines, Neela had been watching everything. As she approached Sean, she told him quietly, "You handled that well." That night, Sean and Han stood together on a rooftop, looking out over the city lights. Han spoke calmly, sharing his thoughts on life. He explained that things aren't as complicated as people make them. Once you make a decision, you stick with it. No second guessing, no regrets. Sean reflected on his past. Back in America, he had been nothing but trouble, constantly running from consequences. His mother couldn't keep up anymore, so she sent him away, hoping a change of environment might help. Now, in Tokyo, things were different. His father gave him structure, discipline, a sense of boundaries. Han, on the other hand, became something like an older brother, showing him a direction, a way forward. Slowly, Sean began to change. Although Han was incredibly skilled behind the wheel, he rarely raced. Instead, he showed Sean what drifting meant to him, not just the technique, but the lifestyle around it. For Han, it wasn't about competition. It was about freedom, connections, and living in the moment. He joked that drifting was his way of meeting beautiful women and enjoying life on his own terms. From there, the training intensified. Han personally guided Sean, step by step, teaching him how to control the car, how to feel the road. To sharpen his skills, he even took him to winding mountain roads, where every turn demanded precision. Day after day, night after night, Sean practiced relentlessly. Eventually, everything started to click. The next time he returned to the parking garage for a race, this time against one of DK's crew, the difference was undeniable. On the same track where he had once been humiliated, Sean now moved with confidence. He drifted through corners smoothly, maintaining control with ease, and this time he won. The victory felt different. It wasn't just about beating someone, it was proof of how far he had come. Riding that momentum, Sean asked Neela out. The two spent the evening together, sharing a late-night meal. Being outsiders in a foreign place, they found comfort in each other, talking endlessly about everything and nothing. Afterward, Neela took him for a drive along a quiet, moonlit slope. The atmosphere was calm, almost dreamlike. It was a rare moment of peace, and something deeper began to form between them. But moments like that don't last forever. Before long, DK tracked them down. everything began unraveling at once. It turned out Han had been skimming money during their operations, quietly keeping a portion for himself. The discrepancy had been discovered by DK's uncle, the powerful figure behind it all. To DK, it was a betrayal. And seeing Neela with Sean only made things worse. In his eyes, both his business partner and his girlfriend had turned against him. Enraged, DK pulled out a gun and aimed it directly at Han. In that tense moment, Twinkie reacted quickly, slamming down a metal shutter to create a distraction. Using the chaos, Han and Sean jumped into a car and sped off, with DK chasing close behind. The pursuit turned into a high-speed escape through the city streets. Then, in a split second, everything went wrong. A passing car collided, sending Han's vehicle flipping out of control. The impact was devastating. The car crashed violently, and in the explosion that followed, Han was killed instantly. The loss hit hard. Sean barely had time to process it. He grabbed Neela, and the two rushed back to his father's place, hoping to find safety. But DK wasn't far behind. He tracked them down and confronted them outside. He demanded that Neela come with him. Tension rose as DK pointed his gun at Sean, but before anything could happen, Sean's father stepped in, leveling his own weapon. The standoff froze everyone in place. No one moved. Then, to break the deadlock and to protect Sean, Neela made a decision. She walked over to DK, choosing to go with him. Sean stood there, helpless, watching her leave. In a single night, he had lost everything. The girl he cared about was gone. The man who had guided him, who had believed in him, was dead, and all of it traced back to one person. This time, Sean wasn't going to run. For the first time, his father didn't try to stop him, because now he could see it clearly. His son had changed. He wasn't the reckless kid from before anymore. He was ready to face things head-on. Sean turned to the one person he knew he could still rely on, Twinkie. Without hesitation, Twinkie handed him a heavy bag filled with cash. It wasn't just random money. Han had been planning ahead, quietly preparing for the day he might have to break away from DK. This stash was meant as a safety net, enough to cover at least part of what was owed to the Yakuza. Clutching the bag, Sean made a bold move. He went straight to the source, the Yakuza's headquarters. This wasn't just about settling a score anymore. He wanted to face the man pulling the strings behind everything, DK's uncle. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Sean stood before the boss, with DK present as well. Without hesitation, he placed the money down, offering it as repayment for Han's missing funds. But he didn't stop there. Sean proposed a resolution, something simple but decisive. A race, winner stays. Loser leaves Tokyo for good. The room fell quiet for a moment. The boss, now satisfied after receiving the money, seemed more relaxed. After considering it briefly, he agreed. It was a clean solution, one that avoided further complications. From the way things played out, it was clear that the boss had already begun distancing himself from DK. After all, much of his success had come through Han's involvement. With Han gone, DK's value had diminished. Sean's proposal just gave him a convenient way to settle everything. There was only one problem. Sean didn't have a car. Determined, he and Han's old crew rushed back to the garage, hoping to find something they could use. But when they arrived, their hopes dropped. The police had already cleared the place out, taking nearly everything. For a moment, it felt like a dead end. Then someone noticed something in the back. The Nissan Silvia S15, the same car Sean had once destroyed, was still there. It wasn't in great shape, but when Sean popped the hood, he saw what mattered most. The engine was still intact. That was enough. An idea sparked instantly. Since the Silvia's body was beyond saving, they decided to pull the engine out and transplant it into something else, his father's old 1967 Ford Mustang. What had once been a worn-out shell suddenly became the foundation for something entirely new. Piece by piece, the team worked together, rebuilding it from the ground up. By the time they were done, the result was something unique, a fusion of classic muscle and modern performance. The night before the race, Sean stood at the top of a mountain road, staring down at the winding path below. This wasn't just another racetrack. It was narrow, dangerous, and unforgiving. One mistake could send a car straight off the edge. When race day arrived, the stakes were clear. The Yakuza boss showed up to watch. DK pulled in, still behind the wheel of his Nissan Fairlady 350Z, confident as ever. The race began. Right from the first turn, DK took the lead, his experience on mountain roads giving him the advantage. Sean followed closely behind, staying focused. Then came the next corner. This time, Sean made his move. With precise control, he drifted through the turn, using the momentum to slip past DK and take the lead. It was smooth, calculated, and it worked. But DK wasn't about to lose quietly. He went back to his old tactics, slamming into Sean's car again and again, trying to force him off the road. The cliffside loomed dangerously close, the drop below offering no second chances. Each time Sean managed to recover, relying on everything he had learned. The attacks kept coming, growing more aggressive. Then, in a critical moment, as DK charged forward for another hit, Sean did something unexpected. He slammed on the brakes. Caught off guard, DK couldn't react in time. His car lost control, lifted off the ground, and spiraled over the edge. In seconds, it disappeared down the mountainside. Silence followed. The race was over. Sean had won. True to his word, the Yakuza boss honored the agreement. He allowed Sean and Neela to leave without interference. From that point on, they were free. With DK gone, a new name took his place. Sean became the new Drift King of Tokyo. Life began to settle. Neela stayed by his side, and the two grew closer, enjoying the peace they had fought so hard for. But in this world, things rarely stay quiet for long. One day, someone showed up, claiming to be connected to Han, and he had come with one purpose: to challenge Sean. There's a very specific kind of statement a film makes in its first few minutes, and the Fast and the Furious, Tokyo Drift wastes absolutely no time making one. It opens not with quiet setup, not with character intros, but with chaos, a high-speed race tearing through a half-built suburban development. It's loud, reckless, and completely over the top. Cars crash through unfinished houses, engines scream, metal bends, and within seconds, the film is already telling you exactly what matters here. This isn't about subtle storytelling. This is about impact. That opening race does more than just grab attention. It defines the entire identity of the film. The exaggerated stakes, the macho energy, the sense that logic takes a backseat to spectacle, it's all there, front-loaded before the story even properly begins. You're not being eased into this world, you're being thrown into it at full speed, and in a way, that's the point. Because from that very first sequence, Tokyo Drift establishes its priorities with complete clarity. The film isn't trying to reinvent the formula, it's doubling down on it. Fast cars, risky decisions, adrenaline-fueled chaos, everything is amplified, everything is immediate. But there's something else buried in that opening as well. For all its intensity, there's a sense of familiarity to it. The structure, the setup, even the outcome, it all feels like something we've seen before. The rebellious teenager, the dangerous race, the inevitable consequences, it plays out exactly the way you expect it to. And that predictability becomes important, because it hints at a larger pattern the film will continue to follow. So while the sequence is undeniably energetic, even entertaining, it also quietly reveals one of the film's biggest limitations. It's not here to surprise you. It's here to deliver a very specific experience, one built on speed, style, and spectacle. And if you're on board with that, the opening works. It hooks you, it excites you, it pulls you straight into the chaos. But if you're looking for something deeper, something more layered or unexpected, the first few minutes already tell you that might not be what you're getting. Either way, by the time that opening race comes to a crashing halt, one thing is clear. Tokyo Drift knows exactly what it is, and it's not slowing down for anyone. After that explosive opening, the film finally slows down, just enough to introduce the foundation of its story. And at its core, Tokyo Drift is built on one of the most familiar setups you can imagine. Sean Boswell is a problem. Not in a complex, layered way, but in the simplest sense possible. He's reckless, impulsive, and addicted to the thrill of racing. Trouble follows him everywhere, and by the time we meet him, it's already clear this isn't his first mistake. It's just the one that finally catches up to him. That opening race isn't just spectacle, it's the breaking point. With the law closing in and no more chances left, Sean is pulled out of his world entirely and sent somewhere that couldn't feel more different: Tokyo. It's not a choice, it's a consequence. A last attempt to straighten him out under the strict supervision of his father, who lays down two simple rules: go to school and stay out of trouble. And of course, that doesn't last. Because what makes this setup interesting isn't just the relocation, it's the contrast. Sean isn't just in a new city, he's completely out of his depth. Different language, different culture, different rules. Everything that once defined him suddenly doesn't apply here. For a moment, it feels like the film might lean into that discomfort. The idea of an outsider trying to adapt, struggling to fit in, navigating a world he doesn't understand, that's a compelling angle. But then the film makes its real move. Instead of focusing on cultural adjustment, it pulls Sean right back into what he knows best: racing. Through a new set of connections, he's introduced to Tokyo's underground scene, where the rules are different, the stakes are higher, and the style of driving itself is something entirely new. Drifting, and just like that, the direction of the film becomes clear. This isn't a story about escaping bad habits, it's about translating them into a new environment. Sean doesn't change, he adapts. The same recklessness that got him into trouble becomes the very thing that pulls him deeper into Tokyo's racing world, which creates an interesting tension. On one hand, the setup promises growth, a chance for Sean to learn, evolve, maybe even mature. But on the other, everything around him keeps reinforcing the same behavior that defined him from the start. and that contradiction sits right at the heart of the film. Because from this point forward, Tokyo Drift isn't really about whether Sean will stay out of trouble, it's about how far he's willing to go once he's back in it. And as the story unfolds, it becomes clear Tokyo isn't a place where he escapes his past. It's a place where that past evolves into something much bigger. And this is where Tokyo Drift does something that, at the time, felt almost unthinkable for a franchise like this. It walks away from everything that made it recognizable. No familiar faces, no returning leads, no direct continuation of the story audiences had been following. Instead of building on what came before, the film hits reset, new characters, new location, new tone. For a series still trying to define itself, that's not just a creative decision, it's a risk. Because up until this point, the Fast and the Furious had been anchored by its core personalities. Whether you connected with them or not, they gave the series a sense of identity. Remove them, and suddenly you're left with a question the film never stops circling. Is this still part of the same franchise, or is it something else entirely? Tokyo Drift doesn't answer that immediately. In fact, for most of its runtime, it almost avoids the question altogether. The story unfolds in isolation, disconnected from the events and characters that came before. There's no reliance on continuity, no effort to tie threads together. If anything, it feels like a standalone racing film that just happens to carry the Fast and Furious name, and for some viewers that works. Stripped of expectations, the film can be approached on its own terms, a self-contained story about a kid, a new city, and a different style of racing. In that context, the absence of familiar characters becomes less of a loss and more of a clean slate. It allows the film to experiment, to shift its focus, to explore a different corner of this world without being tied down by legacy. But for others, that same decision feels like a disconnect. Because without those familiar anchors, the film risks losing what made the franchise feel cohesive in the first place. The emotional continuity, the recognizable dynamics, the sense that each installment is building towards something larger, all of that is largely missing here. Instead, you get a film that feels separate, almost like a spin-off rather than a true sequel, and that tension defines the experience. For most of the runtime, Tokyo Drift exists in its own lane, unbothered by what came before, focused entirely on its own story. It's only in the final moments, with a brief but impactful cameo, that the film suddenly reconnects to the larger franchise. And in that instant, everything shifts. Because that cameo doesn't just link the film back, it reframes it. What once felt isolated now feels intentional. What seemed disconnected now becomes a piece of a bigger puzzle. It's a small moment, but it carries a lot of weight, reminding the audience that this story does belong here, even if it took a different path to get there. So the question remains, is Tokyo Drift a true continuation of the franchise, or a standalone experiment wearing its name? The answer is both, and whether that balance works or not depends entirely on what you came here expecting. If there's one element Tokyo Drift lines on more than anything else to redefine itself, it's the setting. Because moving the story to Tokyo isn't just a backdrop change, it's the film's biggest selling point. From the moment Sean steps into the city, everything feels different. The neon lights, the crowded streets, the vertical sprawl of buildings stacked on top of each other. It creates an energy that's instantly distinct from the wide, open roads of the earlier films. This is a tighter world, faster, more controlled, and that change directly shapes how the action unfolds. Racing here isn't about straight-line speed anymore, it's about precision. Tight corners, narrow streets, multi-level parking garages, winding mountain roads, Tokyo forces a completely different driving style, and that's where drifting comes in. Not just as a gimmick, but as a natural extension of the environment. The city itself demands it. You don't dominate these roads by going faster, you dominate them by mastering control. And visually, the film knows how to sell that. There's a constant emphasis on movement through space. The way headlights reflect off glass buildings, the glow of neon bouncing off polished car surfaces, the blur of color as vehicles slide through impossibly sharp turns. At its best, the film turns Tokyo into something almost surreal, a playground of light and motion. But beneath all that style, there's a question the film never fully answers. How much of this world is real, and how much of it is just aesthetic? Because while the setting feels immersive on the surface, the film rarely digs deeper into it. The Yakuza are present, but more as a narrative device than a fully explored element. The underground racing scene exists, but mostly as a stage for action rather than a culture with depth. Even the day-to-day life of Tokyo is largely pushed aside in favor of keeping the story moving. It creates a strange contrast. On one hand, the film is visually rich, there's always something striking to look at. But on the other, it often feels like the city is being observed from a distance, not lived in. It's Tokyo as an idea. Tokyo is spectacle, and yet that spectacle works, because even if the film doesn't fully explore its setting, it absolutely uses it. The environment shapes the racing, the tone, and the identity of the film in ways that set it apart from what came before. It may not be deeply authentic, but it's undeniably effective in giving Tokyo Drift its own visual signature. So while the story might feel familiar, the world around it doesn't. And for a franchise trying to evolve, that difference matters. Once you move past the surface, past the cars, the lights, the energy, the real question begins to take shape. What kind of story is Tokyo Drift actually telling? Because beneath all that motion, the narrative itself is surprisingly thin. At its core, the film follows a very familiar blueprint. A reckless outsider arrives in a new world, struggles to find his place, learns the rules, earns respect, and eventually rises to challenge the one person standing at the top. It's the classic underdog arc, simple, direct, and easy to follow. And to be fair, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. In fact, for some viewers, that simplicity works in the film's favor. It keeps the story accessible, allows the action to take center stage, and avoids unnecessary complications. You always know where things are headed, and in a movie built around speed and spectacle, that clarity can be a strength. But here's the problem. Simplicity is one thing, but a lack of depth is another. Because while the structure is there, the substance often isn't. The film moves from one major beat to the next without giving those moments the time or weight they need to resonate. Relationships form quickly, conflicts escalate suddenly, and resolutions arrive without much emotional buildup. It's less like watching a story unfold, and more like watching a series of checkpoints being ticked off. You meet the rival, you lose the first race. You find a mentor, you train, you return for the final showdown. It all happens exactly as expected, and almost exactly as quickly, and that predictability becomes hard to ignore. There are very few surprises along the way. The film rarely challenges its own structure or takes risks with its narrative direction. Instead, it leans heavily on familiarity, trusting that the formula itself is enough to carry the experience. For some viewers, that's acceptable. For others, it's the film's biggest weakness, because without stronger writing beneath it, the story never quite elevates the action around it. The emotional stakes feel limited, the character arcs feel underdeveloped, and the world itself never fully comes together in a meaningful way. And yet, despite all of that, the story isn't completely without value. There's a certain straightforwardness to it, a clean, almost stripped-down approach that aligns with what the film is trying to be. It doesn't pretend to be more complex than it is. It doesn't hide behind twists or layered storytelling. It simply delivers a basic framework and lets everything else build on top of it. The issue is whether that framework is strong enough to support the film as a whole, and depending on who you ask, the answer to that question changes completely. Because for some, it's a solid, no-frills underdog story that does exactly what it needs to do. For others, it's a missed opportunity, proof that style alone can't replace substance. Either way, one thing becomes clear very quickly. In Tokyo Drift, the story isn't driving the film. It's just trying to keep up with it. If the story gives Tokyo Drift its direction, then pacing is what determines whether that journey actually feels engaging, and this is where the film starts to lose its rhythm. Because structurally, it's not consistent. In fact, it's almost split into three completely different experiences. It begins with that explosive opening race, fast, chaotic, instantly gripping. Within minutes, you're pulled into the energy, the danger, the sheer intensity of what this film wants to be. It's the kind of opening that promises momentum, the kind that makes you expect the film to keep accelerating. But then something shifts. Once the story moves to Tokyo, the pace slows down significantly. The film transitions into setup mode. New characters, new environment, new rules. On paper, this makes sense. The audience needs time to understand this world. The problem is it lingers. Scenes stretch longer than they need to. Key developments happen without urgency. The narrative starts to drift, ironically mirroring the very concept it's built around. There's a noticeable gap where the energy drops, and for a film centered on speed, that absence becomes impossible to ignore. At one point, it even feels like the film forgets what it's supposed to be building toward. The racing, what should be the core driving force, takes a backseat for long stretches. The stakes don't escalate, the tension doesn't build, and the momentum established in the opening begins to fade. You're waiting for something to kick in, and it takes longer than it should. And then almost suddenly, the film snaps back into motion. The final act arrives, and with it, the energy returns. The races become sharper, the stakes finally feel defined, and the narrative pushes toward its conclusion with a sense of urgency that was missing before. The Mountain Road finale, in particular, delivers the kind of intensity the film had been holding back. It's engaging, it's focused, it works, but by that point, the imbalance is already clear. Because when a film is strongest at its beginning and its end, it raises an important question about everything in between. That middle stretch, where the story should be developing, where the characters should be evolving, where the tension should be building, that's where Tokyo Drift struggles the most. Not because nothing happens, but because what does happen doesn't carry enough weight to maintain engagement. The pacing isn't broken, but it isn't smooth either. It starts fast, slows too much, and then rushes to catch up. And while the final act does manage to recover some of that lost momentum, you can't help but feel that the journey getting there could have been much tighter, much sharper, and far more compelling. Because in a film built on speed, momentum isn't just important, it's everything. At the center of Tokyo Drift is a character who's supposed to carry the entire film on his shoulders, Sean Boswell. And the way you respond to him will likely define how you feel about the movie as a whole. Because Sean isn't written as a complex protagonist. He's built on a very familiar foundation, the rebellious outsider, the kid who doesn't fit in, the one who learns the rules of a new world and eventually rises within it. It's a classic arc, one we've seen countless times before. The problem is, familiarity only works when there's something underneath it, and with Sean, that something feels inconsistent. From the start, he's defined by one trait above all else: recklessness. He doesn't think things through, he reacts. He pushes boundaries, makes impulsive decisions, and almost always chooses the riskier path. That's what gets him into trouble in the first place, and it's what follows him all the way to Tokyo. But once he gets there, the film presents an opportunity, a chance for change, a chance for growth, a chance to turn that recklessness into something more controlled, more purposeful. And on a structural level, that transformation does exist. He learns drifting, he trains, he adapts, he gains confidence. By the time we reach the final act, he's no longer the same inexperienced driver who lost his first race. He's improved, more capable, more aware of the world around him. But here's where the disconnect happens. You don't always feel that change, because while the film shows us the steps of his journey, it rarely lets us experience them on an emotional level. His development feels rushed, sometimes even implied rather than earned. Moments that should define his growth pass by quickly, without the depth needed to make them land. And then there's the performance itself. Lucas Black brings a certain physical presence to the role, but the character often comes across as flat, detached, almost expressionless at times. There's a lack of emotional range that makes it difficult to fully connect with him, especially when the film asks us to invest in his rise. It becomes even more noticeable when he shares the screen with stronger personalities. Because in those moments, Sean doesn't feel like the center of the story, he feels like someone moving through it. That doesn't mean the character doesn't work at all. For some viewers, the simplicity is part of the appeal. He's easy to understand, easy to follow, and his underdog journey, no matter how predictable, still has a certain pull. Watching him go from outsider to competitor, from inexperienced to capable, can be satisfying on a basic level. But for others, that simplicity becomes a limitation, because when your lead character lacks depth, the entire film has to work harder to compensate. And in Tokyo Drift, that burden often shifts elsewhere, onto the setting, the action, or the supporting cast. Which raises an interesting question. Is Sean really the driving force of the film, or just the vehicle moving it forward? And depending on how you see him, the answer to that question changes everything. If Sean Boswell is meant to be the center of Tokyo Drift, then it's the characters around him that give the film whatever weight it manages to carry. Because while the protagonist struggles to fully land, the supporting cast is where the movie finds its most interesting moments. And it starts with Han. There's a calmness to his presence that immediately sets him apart. In a film filled with loud personalities and exaggerated energy, Han operates on a completely different frequency. He doesn't demand attention, he naturally draws it. There's something measured about the way he speaks, the way he observes, the way he moves through this world. More importantly, he feels like a character with a life beyond the screen. Where others are defined by a single trait, Han suggests depth. There's mystery there, experience, a sense that he understands the consequences of the world he's part of, even if he chooses to stay in it. And that makes his role more than just a mentor figure. He becomes the emotional anchor the film didn't quite find in its lead. It's no surprise he's the one audiences remember. Then there's DK Takashi, the film's primary antagonist. On paper, he has everything needed to be a compelling rival. He's skilled, respected, deeply connected to the Yakuza, and positioned at the top of this racing hierarchy. He represents the standard Sean has to reach, the obstacle he has to overcome. But in execution, he feels more functional than fully realized. He's defined by dominance and control, but rarely allowed to move beyond that. His motivations stay surface level, his personality remains narrow, and while he serves the story effectively, he never quite evolves into a truly memorable antagonist. He's a presence, but not a layered one. Twinkie, on the other hand, plays a very different role. He's the gateway into this world, the one who introduces Sean to Tokyo's underground scene, explains the rules, and helps bridge the gap between outsider and insider. There's an energy to him, a looseness that contrasts with the film's more serious tone. At times it works. It adds personality, gives the film moments of levity, but it's also inconsistent. When the film leans into humor, he fits naturally. When it shifts into more serious territory, that same energy can feel out of place. It's a balancing act the film never fully stabilizes. And then there's Neela. Positioned as both a romantic interest and a connection point between Sean and DK, she has the potential to be more than just part of the conflict. There are hints of history, hints of complexity, but they're never fully explored. Instead, she remains largely defined by her role within the central rivalry. She's important to the story, but not fully developed within it. Even Sonny Chiba's appearance, brief as it is, adds a certain weight to the world. His presence carries authority, reinforcing the Yakuza element and giving the film a sense of connection to something larger, even if that connection isn't deeply explored. And that's really the pattern across the board. The supporting characters bring texture. They add energy, contrast, and occasionally depth. In some cases, like Han, they elevate the material. In others, they simply fill the roles the story requires. But taken together, they do something important. They compensate. Because in a film where the lead doesn't fully command the screen, it's these surrounding figures that keep the world feeling alive. They provide the moments that stand out, the personalities that linger, the presence that holds your attention when the narrative itself starts to thin, which, in a way, says everything. Tokyo Drift may be Sean's story, but it's the characters around him that make it worth watching. Once you start looking past the surface of Tokyo Drift, one thing becomes increasingly clear: the film isn't really built around performance. And that becomes most noticeable in the acting and dialogue. Across the board, the performances feel uneven, not completely ineffective, but inconsistent enough that it's hard to stay fully immersed. Some scenes land exactly as intended, while others feel stiff, almost mechanical, as if the emotion never quite reaches the surface. A lot of that comes down to delivery. There are moments where lines are spoken rather than felt, where the dialogue exists to move the scene forward, not to reveal anything deeper about the characters. Conversations often feel functional, stripped down to their basic purpose. Say what needs to be said, get to the next beat, move the story along. And that approach creates a limitation, because without strong dialogue, character relationships struggle to develop naturally. Connections form quickly, conflicts escalate abruptly, and emotional beats don't always have the weight they need to resonate. You understand what's happening, but you don't always feel it. At times, this even works against the film's tone. When the movie leans into seriousness, the performances don't always rise to meet that weight. Dramatic moments can feel undercut by flat delivery, and tension that should build instead just passes by. It's not that the actors aren't capable, it's that the material they're working with doesn't give them much room to elevate it. That said, it's not entirely without merit. There are flashes where the cast settles into their roles, moments of natural rhythm, bits of dialogue that feel more relaxed, even a few lines that manage to stick. The use of different accents and cultural backgrounds adds a certain authenticity to the world, even if it doesn't fully translate into stronger character work. But those moments are scattered. Because overall, the film doesn't prioritize dialogue as a storytelling tool. It treats it more like a bridge, something that connects one sequence to the next, rather than something that defines the experience. And in a film like this, that's a deliberate choice. The focus is elsewhere, on movement, on visuals, on action. The expectation isn't that the audience will remember what was said, it's that they'll remember how it felt to watch. Still, that doesn't mean it goes unnoticed, because when the dialogue lacks impact and the performances don't fully carry the emotional weight, it creates a gap, one that the film has to fill through other means, and sometimes it does. But sometimes you can feel exactly what's missing. Tone is one of the more surprising shifts in Tokyo Drift, and it's something you start to notice almost immediately once the film settles into its rhythm. Because compared to what came before, this movie feels different. There's a clear move away from humor. The playful banter, the lighter energy, the moments that break tension with jokes, those elements are noticeably reduced here. Instead, the film leans into a more serious, more grounded approach. The characters take themselves more seriously. The conflicts are framed with more weight. Even the atmosphere feels tighter, more focused. On paper, that sounds like a step forward. A more serious tone can add tension. It can raise stakes. It can give the story a sense of importance that elevates everything around it. And at times, Tokyo Drift does benefit from that shift. Certain moments feel sharper because of it. The rivalries carry a bit more intensity. The world feels less like a playground and more like a space with consequences. But tone is a delicate balance, and here it doesn't always hold. Because while the film wants to be taken seriously, it doesn't always have the depth to support that weight. The story remains simple. The characters aren't fully developed. The dialogue doesn't consistently deliver the emotional impact needed to match the tone. So what you get is a contrast, a film that presents itself with seriousness, but occasionally slips back into the exaggerated, almost over-the-top energy the franchise is known for. Moments that are meant to feel intense can come across as unintentionally flat. Scenes that aim for realism are still surrounded by elements that feel heightened, stylized, even unrealistic, and that creates a bit of friction. For some viewers, this shift works. The reduced humor makes the film feel more focused, more aligned with its central conflict. It strips away distractions and allows the racing and rivalries to take center stage without interruption. For others, it does the opposite. Without that lighter touch, the film can start to feel heavy or even dull in places. The lack of humor removes a layer of personality, and without strong character depth to replace it, the experience can feel more rigid than engaging. It's a subtle but important trade-off, because entertainment isn't just about intensity, it's about variation. It's about knowing when to push forward and when to ease back. And Tokyo Drift, in trying to redefine its tone, sometimes forgets that balance. What's left is a film caught between two identities, not fully serious, not fully playful, just somewhere in between. And whether that works or not depends entirely on what kind of experience you were hoping for when you pressed play. At the end of the day, no matter how much you analyze the story, the characters, or the tone, Tokyo Drift lives or dies on one thing: the racing, because this is where the film puts all of its focus, all of its energy, and all of its identity. Everything else, plot, dialogue, even character development, often feels secondary to what happens when the engines start. And to its credit, the film does bring something new to the table: drifting. Instead of relying on straight-line speed or drag racing, Tokyo Drift shifts the entire dynamic. Now it's about control, about sliding through corners at impossible angles, maintaining precision in spaces that leave no room for error. It's a stylistic change that fits perfectly with the Tokyo setting, transforming the races into something more technical, more fluid, almost like choreography. When it works, it's genuinely exciting. There's a sense of motion that feels different from previous entries. The cars don't just move fast, they flow. Corners become the highlight, not the obstacle. The camera follows that movement, capturing the arcs, the slides, the near misses. It's visually distinct, and at times, it's exactly what the franchise needed to stand apart. But that excitement isn't consistent, because while the concept is strong, the execution varies. Some races feel sharp and engaging, while others start to blur together. The repetition becomes noticeable. The tension doesn't always build, and in certain moments, the editing makes it harder to follow what's actually happening, pulling you out of the experience instead of drawing you deeper into it. There's also a question of impact. Earlier in the film, the races feel like introductions, demonstrations of skill, glimpses into the world. But as the story progresses, not every sequence carries meaningful stakes. You're watching movement, not always feeling consequence. And without that emotional weight, even high-speed action can start to feel distant. That's why the film's strongest moments stand out so clearly. The opening race grabs you immediately, chaotic, destructive, impossible to ignore. And then there's the final mountain showdown, where everything finally comes together. The stakes are clear, the rivalry is defined, and the race itself feels like it actually matters. It's tighter, more focused, and far more engaging than much of what comes before it. In those moments, Tokyo Drift delivers exactly what it promises, but between those peaks, the experience is less consistent. Because while the film understands how to make racing look good, it doesn't always know how to make it feel essential. The spectacle is there, the screeching tires, the flashing lights, the controlled chaos, but the emotional connection behind it isn't always strong enough to sustain it. And that creates a divide. For viewers who come purely for the cars, the speed, the visual thrill, this is more than enough. The film delivers on that level without hesitation. But for those looking for action that builds, evolves, and carries real narrative weight, it doesn't always get there. Because in Tokyo Drift, the racing isn't just part of the story, it is the story. And whether that's a strength or a limitation depends entirely on what you expect from it. If the racing is the heartbeat of Tokyo Drift, then its visual style is what gives that heartbeat its intensity. Because from a directorial standpoint, this film isn't subtle. Justin Lin steps into the franchise and immediately shifts the energy. There's a noticeable push toward movement, toward speed, not just in the cars, but in the way the film itself is constructed. Quick cuts, dynamic camera angles, sweeping shots that follow cars as they slide through tight corners. Everything is designed to keep the momentum alive, even when the story slows down. At its best, it works. There are moments where the camera feels like it's part of the race itself, gliding alongside the cars, weaving through traffic, pulling you into the chaos instead of keeping you at a distance. You feel the proximity, the danger, the precision. It creates a sense of immersion that aligns perfectly with the film's focus on drifting. But that same style can also work against it, because there's a fine line between energy and overload. At times, the editing becomes too aggressive, cutting so quickly that it's hard to track spatial relationships. You know the cars are moving fast, but you're not always sure where they are in relation to each other. The clarity of the action gets lost in the attempt to amplify it, and when that happens, the impact weakens. Instead of building tension through clean visual storytelling, the film sometimes relies on sheer intensity, hoping that speed alone will carry the moment. It's exciting on a surface level, but it doesn't always hold together when you look closer. That music video quality becomes hard to ignore. The combination of rapid editing, stylized lighting, and heavy emphasis on soundtrack-driven sequences gives the film a polished, almost glossy feel. It's visually appealing, but occasionally it lacks the depth you'd expect from more controlled, deliberate direction. Style leads, but substance doesn't always follow. Still, it's not without its strengths. Lin clearly understands how to frame movement. He knows how to make cars look good, how to highlight the mechanics of drifting, how to turn a simple turn into something visually striking. And when the film slows down just enough to let those moments breathe, the direction really shines. There's also a sense that this is a transitional phase. You can see the foundation being built, the stylistic choices, the kinetic energy, the approach to action. These are elements that would later define the franchise in a much bigger way. Here, they're still taking shape, not fully refined, not always consistent, but undeniably present. And that's what makes the direction of Tokyo Drift interesting. It's not perfect, it's not always controlled, but it's ambitious. It's trying to push the series forward, to evolve its visual identity, to find a new rhythm. And even when it stumbles, you can feel that intention behind it, because this isn't just a film that wants to show speed, it wants to feel fast. And whether it succeeds or not depends on how much you value style over precision. But one thing is certain, you'll never confuse it for something static. There's an element in Tokyo Drift that doesn't just support the action, it amplifies it, the soundtrack. From the moment the film gets moving, the music becomes part of the experience, not something sitting quietly in the background, but something actively driving the rhythm of every scene. Techno beats, hip-hop tracks, electronic pulses, each one is carefully layered into the film's high-speed identity, and when it clicks, it really clicks. The races don't just feel fast because of the visuals, they feel fast because of the sound. The music syncs with the movement, the cuts, the momentum. Engines roar, tires screech, and underneath it all, there's this constant pulse pushing everything forward. It creates an energy that's hard to ignore, turning even simple moments into something more intense. In many ways, the soundtrack becomes the film's emotional engine. Where dialogue falls short, music fills the gap. Where character depth is limited, sound carries the atmosphere. It tells you how to feel, when to feel it, and how intense that feeling should be. And in a film that prioritizes sensation over subtlety, that approach makes sense. But like everything else in Tokyo Drift, it's a double-edged sword. Because when the music is doing that much work, it can start to feel like it's compensating for what's missing elsewhere. Instead of enhancing already strong moments, it sometimes becomes the thing holding them together. The energy is there, but it's being generated externally, not always from the scene itself. Still, there's no denying its impact. The soundtrack gives the film a distinct identity. It ties into the urban setting, the underground racing culture, the stylized presentation. It's loud, it's aggressive, it's constantly in motion, just like the film itself. And then there are those moments where everything aligns. The right track hits at the right time, the visuals lock in, the pacing sharpens, and suddenly the film feels exactly as powerful as it wants to be. Those moments don't just elevate the scene, they define it. Because in Tokyo Drift, sound isn't just part of the atmosphere, it is the atmosphere. It's what turns motion into momentum and speed into something you can actually feel. There's a pattern that becomes impossible to ignore the longer Tokyo Drift goes on. The film is at its strongest when it's either just beginning or about to end. Those two moments, the opening and the finale, don't just stand out, they define the entire experience. Right from the start, that opening race hits with raw intensity. It's chaotic, destructive, almost absurd in how far it pushes things, but it works. It grabs your attention immediately, throws you into the film's world without hesitation, and sets a clear expectation for what's to come. It's loud, it's fast, and it's impossible to ignore. For a brief moment, it feels like the film is going to maintain that level of energy throughout. but then the middle happens. And while the film slows down to build its world and characters, it never quite recaptures the same level of engagement it established in those first few minutes. The momentum fades, the tension softens, and the energy becomes inconsistent. You're waiting for that spark to return, for something to bring it all back together, and eventually it does. The finale, the mountain road race, isn't just another sequence, it's the payoff the entire film has been building toward. This is where everything finally aligns. The rivalry is clear, the stakes are defined, and for the first time the race feels like it truly matters. The setting plays a huge role here. Unlike the crowded city streets, the mountain road opens up just enough to create a different kind of tension. It's still tight, still dangerous, but now there's a sense of isolation. No distractions, no spectators dominating the frame, just two drivers, one road, and everything on the line. And that simplicity works in the film's favor. The action feels more focused, the pacing sharpens, the visuals become clearer. You can follow the movement, understand the stakes, and actually feel the progression of the race. It's not just about speed anymore, it's about control, precision, and outcome. And for a moment, the film delivers exactly what it's been promising all along. But that also highlights something else. Because when the opening and the ending are the most memorable parts of a film, it raises an unavoidable question about everything in between. The peaks are strong, no doubt about it. They showcase the film at its most confident, most engaging, most effective. But they also expose the inconsistency of the journey connecting them. It's like two powerful moments struggling to carry the weight of everything around them. And while they succeed in making an impact, they also leave you wondering how much stronger the film could have been if that same level of focus had been maintained throughout. Because in Tokyo Drift, the beginning hooks you, the ending delivers, but it's the space in the middle that decides how much those moments truly matter. For a film that leans so heavily into a grounded, street-level world, Tokyo Drift raises a question that quietly lingers beneath the surface the entire time. How much of this is actually believable? Because the movie constantly presents itself as something rooted in reality, real streets, real cars, real consequences. It wants you to feel like this world exists just beneath the surface, hidden in plain sight. But the deeper you look, the harder that illusion becomes to maintain. It starts with the basics. Sean is placed in a high school environment that never quite feels authentic. The characters don't behave like students, the setting rarely functions like an actual school, and the idea that this entire underground racing culture exists so openly around them feels exaggerated. It's less a believable space and more a backdrop that the film quickly abandons once it's no longer useful. Then there's the racing world itself. The film asks you to accept a reality where high-stakes street racing operates almost like an organized system, complete with hierarchy, reputation, and consequences that resemble a structured underworld. And while that idea is compelling on paper, the execution stretches credibility. The scale, the frequency, the lack of real-world consequences, it all starts to feel more like a stylized fantasy than something grounded in reality. But the biggest issue comes from the character progression. Sean goes from someone who barely understands drifting to someone capable of challenging and ultimately defeating a seasoned expert. And while the film tries to frame this as growth, it happens so quickly, with so little resistance, that it feels less like earned development and more like narrative convenience. You're not watching someone rise through skill, you're watching the story decide he's ready. And that disconnect matters, because when the outcome of the film hinges on that final race, the believability of Sean's journey becomes essential. If you don't buy how he got there, it's harder to fully invest in what happens when he arrives. There are smaller details, too. The way conflicts are resolved, the ease with which characters move between worlds, the lack of lasting consequences for dangerous actions. It all contributes to a sense that the film is operating on its own internal logic rather than reflecting anything real. And to be fair, that's not necessarily a flaw in isolation. Tokyo Drift isn't trying to be a documentary. It's not aiming for strict realism. It's building a stylized version of reality where speed, risk, and image take priority over plausibility. But the issue is consistency, because the film occasionally presents itself as grounded, serious, consequence-driven, while simultaneously asking the audience to accept scenarios that don't quite hold up under scrutiny. It wants the weight of realism without fully committing to it, and that creates a subtle tension. You're pulled into the world by its surface-level authenticity, but as the story unfolds, that foundation starts to feel less stable. The rules shift, the logic bends, and the line between believable and exaggerated becomes harder to define. In the end, it comes down to expectation. If you're willing to accept the film on its own terms, to embrace the stylization and overlook the inconsistencies, it works. The world feels cohesive enough to support the experience. But if you're looking for something that holds up logically, something where actions, consequences, and character growth feel fully earned, Tokyo Drift doesn't quite get there. Because while it looks real, it doesn't always feel it. By the time Tokyo Drift settles into its rhythm, there's a realization that slowly becomes impossible to ignore. You've seen this before. Not necessarily in the details, not in the setting, not in the drifting, not in the neon-lit streets of Tokyo, but in the structure. In the way the story unfolds, in the beats it hits, one after another, with almost mechanical precision. Because underneath all the stylistic changes, the film is built on a formula the franchise has already used. The outsider enters a new world. He challenges the dominant figure. He fails. He finds a mentor. He learns the rules. He returns for the final showdown. It's clean, it's familiar, and most importantly, it's predictable. Now, predictability isn't always a flaw. There's a comfort in structure, a sense of rhythm that allows the audience to settle in, to anticipate what's coming next, to enjoy the journey even if they already know the destination. Many films thrive on that kind of familiarity, but the difference is in execution, because for a familiar structure to work, it needs variation. It needs moments that feel fresh, unexpected, or emotionally distinct. Something that breaks the pattern just enough to keep the experience engaging, and that's where Tokyo Drift struggles. The film follows its blueprint so closely that it rarely surprises you. Each major turn arrives exactly when you expect it. Each conflict resolves in the way you've already imagined. Even the emotional beats feel predetermined, as if the story is moving along a track it never intends to leave. It doesn't challenge the formula, it relies on it. And while the drifting concept adds a layer of visual distinction, it doesn't fundamentally change the narrative underneath. Strip away the setting, the cars, the style, and what you're left with is a story that could exist almost anywhere. That's why some viewers describe it as the same movie in a different location, because in many ways it is. The framework hasn't evolved, it's just been repackaged, but here's the interesting part. For some audiences, that's enough. If what you're looking for is a familiar experience, something that delivers exactly what it promises without deviation, then this structure works. It's reliable, it's easy to follow. It gives you the satisfaction of knowing where things are headed and watching them play out. But for others, it becomes limiting. Because when a film doesn't take risks with its structure, when it doesn't push beyond what's expected, it starts to feel repetitive. Not just within itself, but within the larger context of the franchise. And that repetition creates a ceiling. No matter how good the individual moments are, no matter how strong the visuals or the action might be, the story can only go so far if it refuses to evolve. And Tokyo Drift, for all its stylistic ambition, never quite breaks free from that pattern. It moves fast, it looks different, but underneath it all, it's still following the same road. At a certain point, Tokyo Drift stops being judged only as a chapter in its own franchise, and starts being measured against something much bigger. Because once you strip away the branding, what you're left with is a racing film, and that places it in direct conversation with an entire genre that's been evolving for decades. And that comparison isn't always in its favor. There's a clear influence here from Asian street racing cinema. The emphasis on drifting, the tight mountain roads, the technical precision of the driving, it all echoes elements seen in earlier racing films from that space. You can feel the inspiration in the way the races are framed, in how the environment shapes the action, even in the overall tone of the competition. But influence and execution are two very different things. Because while Tokyo Drift borrows the aesthetic, it doesn't always capture the depth that made those films work. In some of those stories, the racing isn't just spectacle, it's tied to character, to identity, to a deeper understanding of skill and discipline. The action carries meaning beyond the moment. Here, it's more surface level. The races look good, they move well, they deliver excitement, but they don't always carry the same narrative weight. The connection between driver and machine, between skill and consequence, isn't explored with the same level of detail. It's implied but rarely expanded, and that creates a gap. Because when compared to other racing films, especially those that treat driving as more than just action, Tokyo Drift can feel lighter, less grounded in its own subject. It adopts the style without fully embracing the substance behind it. At the same time, it's also competing with a different kind of benchmark, Hollywood action. Big, explosive, high-stakes set pieces where clarity, tension, and escalation are key, and in that space, the film has its own challenges. Some sequences lack the precision needed to fully communicate what's happening. Others prioritize speed over structure, making them visually impressive but harder to follow, so it ends up caught between two worlds. On one side, the technical, character-driven racing films it draws inspiration from. On the other, the large-scale action spectacles it's trying to match, and while it takes elements from both, it never fully commits to either approach. But that doesn't mean it fails outright, because even within those comparisons, Tokyo Drift still manages to carve out its own identity. The combination of drifting, urban Tokyo, and stylized presentation gives it a distinct flavor, something recognizable, even if it's not the most refined version of what the genre can offer. It may not redefine racing films, it may not outdo the best examples in the genre, but it does something different enough to stand alongside them, even if it never quite rises above them. And in a genre built on speed, precision, and control sometimes, just staying in the race is part of the achievement. By the time Tokyo Drift settles into its identity, one thing becomes very clear. This film knows exactly who it's made for. And it doesn't try to hide it. At its core, Tokyo Drift isn't chasing complex themes or layered storytelling. It's built around a very specific fantasy: speed, rebellion, and image. Fast cars tearing through neon streets, characters living on the edge, a world where respect is earned through risk and identity is defined by what you drive. It's not subtle, and it's not meant to be. The film leans heavily into that adrenaline-driven lifestyle. Everything is heightened: the way characters talk, the way they act, the way they carry themselves. There's a constant sense of attitude, of posturing, of proving something. Not through dialogue or introspection, but through action, through racing. And within that framework, the themes are simple but consistent: control versus chaos, outsider versus insider, respect versus dominance. Sean's journey fits neatly into that structure. He enters as someone out of control, reckless, unrefined, out of place, and the film positions drifting as the tool that brings that chaos into focus. It's not just about learning to drive differently, it's about learning discipline, even if that lesson is delivered through speed and risk rather than reflection. But again, it's all presented on the surface. The film doesn't dig deeply into these ideas. It doesn't explore them in a nuanced way. Instead, it uses them as a backdrop, a thematic layer that supports the action rather than driving it. And that ties directly into its target audience, because this is a film designed for viewers who are here for the experience, not the analysis: car enthusiasts, adrenaline seekers. Younger audiences drawn to the style, the energy, the spectacle. It speaks directly to that crowd, delivering exactly what they're looking for without overcomplicating things. The cars are flashy, the races are loud. The world is stylized and exaggerated. It's a cinematic fantasy of speed and status. And for that audience, it works. But for viewers looking for something deeper, strong character exploration, meaningful themes, emotional complexity, it can feel limited. Not because those elements are completely absent, but because they're never fully developed. They exist, but they don't evolve. And that's the defining trade-off. Tokyo Drift chooses clarity over complexity, energy over introspection, style over substance. It builds a world that's easy to step into, easy to understand, and easy to enjoy if you're aligned with what it's offering. So the question isn't whether the film succeeds on its own terms. It does. The real question is whether those terms are enough for you. Because if you're here for speed, style, and spectacle, Tokyo Drift delivers exactly that, and it never pretends to be anything else. There's another aspect of Tokyo Drift that sits just beneath the surface of all the speed and spectacle: the way it represents women. And once you start paying attention to it, it becomes hard to ignore. Because in this film, women rarely exist as fully realized characters. Instead, they're positioned around the action, present, visible, but often not central to the story itself. They're part of the environment, part of the atmosphere that surrounds the racing world. Nayla, the primary female character, is the closest the film comes to giving a woman narrative importance. She has connections to both Sean and DK, placing her directly within the central conflict. There are hints of backstory, hints of emotional depth, even glimpses of independence, but those moments never fully develop. Instead, she's largely defined by her relationships, by how she fits into the rivalry between two men. Her role becomes less about her own journey and more about what she represents within the story: a connection point, a motivator, a piece of the conflict. And beyond her, the portrayal becomes even more limited. Throughout the film, women are frequently presented as part of the visual identity, stylized, glamorous, often reduced to background presence. They populate the racing scenes, the parties, the gatherings, adding to the film's aesthetic but rarely influencing its direction. It's not subtle. The camera lingers. The framing emphasizes appearance over character. And while this approach aligns with the film's broader focus on image and lifestyle, it also reinforces a very narrow perspective. Women are part of the world, but not shaping it. Now, to be fair, this isn't unique to Tokyo Drift. It's a pattern that exists across much of the genre, especially in films built around cars, competition, and hypermasculine environments. The emphasis tends to fall on speed, dominance, and spectacle, with female characters often placed at the edges of that experience. But that doesn't make it invisible, because when a film leans this heavily into style, every element of that style becomes part of the conversation, including how people are presented within it. And here, the presentation is clear. Women are tied to the fantasy the film is selling. They're part of the image, part of the energy, part of the appeal, but they're rarely given the space to exist beyond that, which creates a limitation. Because while the film builds a world that feels vibrant and alive, it does so through a very specific lens, one that prioritizes certain perspectives while leaving others underexplored. And whether that stands out as a flaw or simply a reflection of the film's priorities depends on how you engage with it. But either way, it's a piece of the film's identity, one that moves just as consistently as the cars on screen, even if it's not always moving forward. By this point, the question practically asks itself, what exactly are you watching Tokyo Drift for? Because everything about this film exists in a kind of tension between two very different ideas, entertainment and substance. On one side, it's easy to see why the movie works. It's fast, it's loud, it's visually engaging. The cars look incredible, the races carry energy, the setting adds a fresh layer of style. There's a constant sense of motion, a steady flow of spectacle that keeps the film moving even when the story itself slows down. And for a lot of viewers, that's more than enough. This is the kind of movie you can sit back and experience rather than analyze. It doesn't demand deep investment. It doesn't ask you to unpack complex themes or follow intricate character arcs. It gives you a world, fills it with speed and intensity, and lets you enjoy the ride. In that sense, it succeeds. But then there's the other side, because once you start looking beyond the surface, the limitations become clear. The story lacks depth, the characters aren't fully developed, the dialogue rarely carries emotional weight. Many of the moments that should connect on a deeper level simply pass by without leaving a lasting impact, and that creates a gap. A gap between what the film shows you and what it makes you feel. The spectacle is there, undeniably, but the substance underneath it isn't always strong enough to support it. So what you're left with is a film that moves quickly, looks impressive, and keeps your attention, but doesn't necessarily stay with you once it's over. And that divide is what defines the experience. For some, Tokyo Drift is exactly what it needs to be, a fun, energetic, no-frills racing movie that delivers on its promise without overcomplicating things. It knows its audience, gives them what they want, and moves on. For others, it feels like a missed opportunity, because the foundation is there, the setting is strong, the concept has potential, the characters could have been explored more deeply, the story could have carried more weight. There's space for something more, and the film never quite reaches it, so it becomes a matter of expectation. If you come in looking for adrenaline, style, and a straightforward experience, the film delivers. If you come in looking for depth, emotional resonance, or narrative complexity, it falls short, and neither perspective is wrong, because Tokyo Drift isn't trying to be everything, it's choosing one side of that balance. The question is whether that choice works for you, because in the end, this isn't a film that blends entertainment and substance, it's a film that clearly picks one, and drives full speed in that direction. And this is where Tokyo Drift becomes far more interesting than it first appears, because its true value isn't just in what it is, it's in what it leads to. On its own, the film feels like a detour, a side story. Something disconnected from the main road the franchise had been traveling. New characters, new setting, a different tone. It almost feels like the series stepped away from itself, unsure of where to go next. But in hindsight, that detour starts to look a lot more like a turning point. This is the moment where Justin Lin steps in and begins reshaping the identity of the franchise. The energy, the pacing, the visual style, the emphasis on movement and spectacle, these are elements that would go on to define the series in a much bigger way. They're not fully refined here, but you can see them taking form. You can feel the shift, and then there's Han, a character who, in this film, feels almost self-contained, important within the story, but not necessarily central to the larger franchise. And yet, he becomes one of the most enduring figures moving forward. His presence here doesn't just add depth to Tokyo Drift, it plants a seed that future films would build on in ways this movie never fully suggests. Even the timeline itself becomes part of the film's legacy. What initially feels like a disconnected story eventually gets woven back into the larger narrative through later installments. Events are revisited, recontextualized, even rewritten to make everything fit together. It's a clear sign that the franchise didn't leave Tokyo Drift behind, it found a way to bring it back into the fold. And then there's that final moment, a brief cameo that at the time felt like a simple nod to the past, but in retrospect, it carries far more weight. It bridges the gap between what the series was and what it would become. It reconnects the film to the franchise's core identity and sets the stage for what comes next. Because after this, everything changes. The series evolves, the scale expands, the storytelling shifts, the characters return. And the foundation laid here, style, tone, direction, becomes part of something much bigger, which makes Tokyo Drift a strange kind of film. On the surface, it can feel like one of the most disconnected entries in the franchise. But in reality, it's one of the most important, not because it perfects the formula, but because it helps redefine it. It's not the destination, it's the pivot, the moment where the franchise stops trying to repeat itself and starts becoming something else entirely. So after everything, after the setting, the characters, the racing, the style, the flaws, where does Tokyo Drift actually land? The answer isn't simple, because few films in this franchise divide opinion quite like this one. On one side, there are viewers who genuinely love it. For them, Tokyo Drift represents something pure, a return to the core idea of the series, racing at the center, a simple story. A focus on cars, culture, and competition without the distractions that would come later. It's clean, it's direct, and it delivers exactly what they want. For some, it's even one of the best entries in the franchise. But then there's the other side. The viewers who see it as a step down. A film that strips away what made the earlier entries engaging without replacing it with something stronger. They point to the weak story, the flat protagonist, the inconsistent pacing, the lack of emotional depth, and for them, those issues aren't minor. They define the experience. To them, Tokyo Drift isn't underrated, it's underwhelming. And that split is what makes the film so interesting to talk about, because both perspectives are valid. This is a movie that delivers in very specific areas and falls short in others just as clearly. It succeeds when it leans into style, energy, and spectacle. It struggles when it asks for deeper investment in story or character. It introduces new ideas but doesn't always fully explore them. It takes risks, but not all of them pay off. And that leaves it in a unique position within the franchise, not the strongest entry, not the weakest either, but one that stands apart, both in how it was received and in what it represents. Because beyond the immediate experience, there's something else to consider: time. Over the years, Tokyo Drift has been reevaluated. What once felt like a disconnected experiment now looks more like a foundational step. What seemed like a departure now feels like a transition. And for some viewers, that shift in perspective has made the film more enjoyable in retrospect than it was at release. But even with that context, the core experience doesn't change. If you come to Tokyo Drift for fast cars, stylized racing, and a straightforward underdog story, it delivers. You'll find moments to enjoy, sequences that stand out, and an overall experience that keeps you engaged. If you're looking for depth, strong character work, or a narrative that pushes beyond the familiar, it won't quite get there. And that's ultimately what defines the film. It knows what it wants to be, it commits to that identity, and it leaves everything else behind. So the final verdict isn't about whether Tokyo Drift is good or bad. It's about what you value in a film like this. Because if you're here for the ride, you'll get one. But if you're looking for more than just the road ahead, you might find yourself wanting something it never intended to give.